The auction house smelled like old money and older regret, polished floors, cedar paneling, and the faint trace of cigars that no one had smoked in years but somehow never quite left. Hugh Calloway stood near the back wall with his arms crossed, wearing the same jacket he'd worn to his daughter's school play 3 weeks earlier. It still had a faint smear of face paint on the left cuff, gold and purple, because Zoe had been playing a queen. He hadn't noticed it until he got to the registration desk, and by then it was too late to care. He was 47 years old, a widower going on 6 years, and a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades learning how to read things other people threw away. The Pemberton Estate Auction was not the kind of event that advertised itself widely. It ran once a year in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Kelowna, British Columbia, and the people who attended it fell into 2 camps: dealers who came to buy cheap and sell expensive, and collectors who came to buy expensive and feel something. Hugh had been coming since he was 32, when his wife Donna was still alive, and used to tease him about it from the passenger seat of their old Civic on the long drive down from Vernon. She called it his treasure hunting problem. She wasn't wrong. The catalog for this year's auction had been sitting on Hugh's kitchen table for 11 days before he found the listing on page 43, lot 178, provenance unknown, estate piece believed to be mid-century, musical instrument non-functional, no reserve. There was a single photograph. It was blurry and underlit, taken at an angle that suggested whoever took it had done so as an afterthought. But Hugh had looked at it for a long time, longer than he'd looked at anything in recent memory, and something in the back of his mind had gone very, very quiet. The way a room goes quiet when something important is about to happen. He'd driven down to Kelowna on a Thursday, taken a room at a budget motel on the highway, and arrived at the preview showing on Friday morning before it officially opened. He'd told the floor assistant he was a registered bidder and needed to see lot 178. The assistant, a young man with the polished indifference of someone trained to be helpful without being curious, had led him to a side table near the fire exit. The violin case was green, a dark institutional green, the kind that used to be fashionable in the 1940s and had since become the color of things forgotten. The latches were tarnished, one of the hinges was loose. Inside, on a bed of faded burgundy velvet that had partially collapsed at one end, lay the instrument. Hugh put on his reading glasses. He stood there for 9 minutes. He didn't touch it. He just looked at the scroll, at the grain of the spruce top, at the shape of the F-holes, at the way the amber varnish had worn through at the shoulder where a chin rest had rubbed against it for years. He looked at the label visible through the upper F-hole, faded and water-stained and barely legible. He stood up, took off his glasses, folded them carefully, and put them back in his breast pocket. He went back to his motel room and did not sleep particularly well. The next morning he was sitting in row 7 when the auction began, the room filled up by 10 o'clock. Hugh recognized a few faces: Gordon Ashcroft, who ran an antique furniture business out of Vancouver, a woman named Tricia something who bought estate jewelry on behalf of clients in Toronto, a heavy-set man near the front whose name Hugh didn't know but whose bidding paddle never seemed to stay down for long. There were also younger people, maybe in their 30s, who had the careful, observant look of first-timers trying not to seem like first-timers. The auctioneer was a man named Barry Westholt, who had the kind of voice built for calling bids, loud without being aggressive, warm without being friendly. He moved through the early lots quickly: a set of mid-century dining chairs, a landscape oil painting in a cracked gilt frame, a collection of silver serving pieces. The room was attentive but relaxed, the way a crowd gets when it's comfortable but not yet excited. Hugh sat with his paddle in his lap and watched the door. He arrived at 10:20. His name, Hugh would learn later, was Dominic Farrell. He was somewhere in his mid-50s with silver hair swept back from a high forehead and the kind of tan that comes from ski hills rather than beaches. He wore a charcoal blazer over a pale blue open-collar shirt and moved through the room the way men do when they are accustomed to being noticed. 2 people were with him, a young woman with a tablet computer and a man in a darker suit who stood slightly behind and to the right the way an assistant stands when his job is to be present but not visible. Dominic Farrell was the founder and managing partner of Farrell Cultural Acquisitions, a private firm based in Toronto with satellite offices in Montreal and Calgary. Hugh knew this because he had looked it up the previous evening, after seeing Farrell's name on the registered bidder list posted near the front desk. Farrell's firm specialized in sourcing historically significant Canadian art and cultural artifacts for private collections and institutional clients. He had been quoted in the Globe and Mail 3 years ago saying that the Canadian secondary market for musical instruments was catastrophically undervalued and ripe for intelligent acquisition. He had meant it as a business observation. He had not been wrong. Barry Westholt reached lot 178 at 11:47. Two assistants brought it out on a rolling trolley. The green case looked even shabbier under the auction house lighting, institutional undercleaned, visibly damaged at one corner where the vinyl had peeled back to reveal bare cardboard. A ripple of mild amusement moved through the room. Someone near the back said something quietly and the person next to them smiled. Lot 178, Barry said with the professional neutrality of a man who had learned long ago not to editorialize. Est piece, instrument presented as is, no reserve. Do I have an opener? Dominic Farrell had not sat down. He was standing near the left aisle with his arms folded, looking at the case on the trolley. His assistant was beside him, tablet in hand. The young woman typed something. 500, said the man near the front, the heavy-set one whose paddle was always moving. 500, thank you. Do I have 6? 6, said someone else. Hugh kept his paddle in his lap. 708, 1,000, said Dominic Farrell. His voice carried easily, not loud, just clear, the kind of voice that has never had to compete for a room's attention. Several people turned to look at him. He didn't acknowledge them. 1,000, thank you. Do I have 1,100? The heavy-set man near the front looked at Farrell, assessed something, and shook his head almost imperceptibly. He set his paddle down on his knee. 1,100, said Hugh. Barry looked at him. 1,100, the gentleman in row 7. Do I have 12? Dominic Farrell turned his head and looked at Hugh. It was a measuring sort of look. Not hostile exactly, but deliberate. The kind of look that is trying to determine something. 1,500, Farrell said. 2,000, said Hugh. Farrell paused. He turned to his assistant and said something that Hugh couldn't hear. The young woman looked at her tablet and said something back. Then Farrell looked at the case again, at the battered green vinyl and the peeling corner and the loose hinge. He said nothing. 2,000 going once, Barry said. 2,000 going twice. Dominic Farrell uncrossed his arms. He stepped toward the center of the room, not toward the front, and raised his voice so the room could hear him. Might I say something? Barry paused. This was not standard procedure, but Dominic Farrell was not the kind of man one stopped mid-sentence. Briefly, Barry said. I've done some preliminary research on this lot, Farrell said, addressing the room rather than the auctioneer. My team looked into it this morning. The instrument in that case is not what it appears to be on the label. The label has been altered. We believe it was repapered sometime in the 70s or 80s, probably to inflate the provenance. The instrument itself is almost certainly a student-grade workshop piece from Eastern Europe, mass-produced, no significant history. I want buyers to be informed before they spend money chasing a story that isn't there. The room was quiet. Hugh looked at the case on the trolley. That's very considerate of you, Barry said carefully. I'm simply saying, Farrell continued, that whoever is bidding at $2,000 on that instrument is making an error based on incomplete information. There's no shame in withdrawing. He looked at row 7 when he said it. Hugh held his paddle loosely in his right hand. He thought about Donna briefly, the way she used to say, if you know what you're looking at, you don't need anyone's permission to look at it. He thought about Zoe, who was 12 and who had started playing violin 3 years ago and who practiced in the living room on Tuesday and Thursday evenings while Hugh made dinner and listened through the kitchen doorway. He thought about what he had seen, standing at that side table near the fire exit with his glasses on, for 9 uninterrupted minutes. He raised his paddle. 2,000, he said. Still me. Barry Westholt cleared his throat. 2,000 going once, going a pause that lasted slightly longer than usual. Sold. Dominic Farrell did not speak to Hugh after the sale. He collected his catalog, spoke briefly to his assistant, and left the room before the next lot was called. Hugh watched him go. He felt with some precision that this was not the last time their paths would intersect on this particular subject. He carried the case to his car himself, placing it carefully in the back seat and putting his folded rain jacket over it so it wouldn't slide during the drive. He drove back to his motel, ordered a sandwich from the place across the highway, and sat at the small table by the window with the case open in front of him, eating and looking at the instrument in the pale afternoon light. He had a practice he'd developed over many years. When he found something he believed in, he gave himself 24 hours before doing anything about it. 24 hours to sit with the doubt, to poke at it, to see if it held up. Donna had thought this was one of his better qualities. You don't panic in either direction, she used to say. That's rarer than you think. He spent that evening at his laptop, not to confirm what he already suspected, but to map out the path he would need to follow to prove it. Hugh Calloway was not a musician. He had never played an instrument in his life with any seriousness. What he was, and had been since his late 20s, was a man who knew how to read objects, how to look past the surface condition of a thing and understand what it actually was. He had started as a carpenter, which taught him wood grain and joinery. He had spent his 30s doing restoration work on heritage buildings in the Okanagan, which taught him materials and periods. He had stumbled into instrument collecting sideways, through a job restoring the interior of a church in Penticton, when the pastor had asked if he knew anyone who could look at an old organ that had been sitting in the basement for 30 years. Hugh had said he would take a look himself, mostly out of curiosity. He had ended up spending 3 months learning enough to determine that the organ was not particularly significant, but that the 2 violins stored in a trunk beside it might be worth a serious look. They were. That had been 16 years ago. Since then, Hugh had built a quiet, unshouted reputation among a small community of luthiers, auction houses, and private collectors in Western Canada. He was not famous. He did not have a firm or a website or a business card that said anything impressive. What he had was a phone that rang occasionally from people who had found something and wanted a second pair of eyes. He knew about labels. He knew that instrument labels were among the most commonly falsified details in the trade, pasted in, repapered, photographed, and reprinted. He also knew that labels were not what you looked at first. You looked at the wood, you looked at the varnish, you looked at the scroll and the graduation of the top and the cut of the F-holes, and a dozen other things that no forger ever bothered to replicate accurately because the buyers they were fooling were looking at the label. What Hugh had seen standing at that side table with his glasses on was not the label. He had seen the scroll, it was hand-carved. Not the mechanical regularity of workshop production, but the slight deliberate asymmetry of individual handwork. A human choice made in wood a century and a half or more ago, by someone who had been trained in a particular tradition and had internalized it so completely that it showed up in the smallest details. The chamfer on the peg box, the set of the neck, the way the ribs met the corners. He had also noticed, with the kind of quiet that comes just before something important, that the varnish on the underside of the upper bout had a particular quality. A depth and warmth that was not a product of age alone but of a specific process that had become associated, in the literature he had read over many years, with a very small number of makers working in a very specific time and place. He did not say the name even to himself until he had driven back to Vernon and spent 3 weeks making calls. The first call was to a luthier named Eric MacDonald in Victoria who had spent 20 years working in instrument restoration before retiring to a small workshop where he did whatever he wanted. Hugh described what he had seen without naming his suspicion and listened to Eric say slowly, "Well, that's interesting." The second call was to a woman at the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau who handled their instrument collection and who agreed, after some back and forth, to accept photographs and a written description for informal assessment. The third call was to a dealer in Toronto. Not Farrell, someone else, someone who had been in the trade for 40 years and who owed Hugh a small professional favor from a long time ago. This man listened to Hugh's description for about 90 seconds and then said, "Hugh, if you're right about this, you need to talk to the people at the Royal Academy. They have a documentation project on exactly this maker. You need to be in that database." Hugh wrote down the name of the contact and thanked him. He did not panic in either direction. He also, somewhere in those 3 weeks, told his daughter. Not immediately, not the night he got home, when he put the case in the back bedroom and made dinner, and listened to Zoe practice her scales and said nothing because he needed to sit with it a little longer. But on a Sunday about 10 days in, when Zoe came into the kitchen for a glass of water after practice and found him at the table with the case open and his laptop beside it and photographs spread out across the surface. Zoe was 12, and she had the particular perceptiveness of a child who has spent years in a quiet house with a quiet parent, learning to read the difference between the silences. She looked at the violin on the table and then at her father. "Is that the one from the auction?" she said. "Yeah." She sat down across from him and looked at it the way she had learned to look at things, carefully and without rushing. "Is it old?" "I think so," Hugh said. "How old?" "That's what I'm trying to find out." Zoe looked at the photographs on the table. She picked one up, a close-up of the scroll, and studied it. "It's different from mine," she said. "Yes, how?" Hugh looked at his daughter. He thought about how to explain it. "Yours was made by a machine," he said. "This one was made by a person. And the person who made it, I think, was someone very specific. Someone with a name." Set the photograph down. "Who?" "I'm still checking," Hugh said. She nodded, accepting this as a reasonable answer, and went back to the living room. That night she played for an extra half hour after dinner. Hugh stood in the kitchen doorway and listened and thought about something he hadn't let himself think about yet. What it would mean if he was right. The confirmation came on a Wednesday in mid-November, in the form of an email from the Royal Academy's documentation project team in London, following a video call the previous week during which Hugh had presented the instrument under controlled lighting while 2 specialists on the other side of the screen took notes without saying much. The email was 3 paragraphs long. It was careful and appropriately qualified. It used phrases like strongly indicative and consistent with documented examples and pending physical examination. The instrument appears, all the language of people who know that precision matters and that certainty is earned in stages. But it also contained in the final sentence of the second paragraph a specific name and a specific assessment and a specific comparison to 3 other instruments whose documentation was considered settled. Hugh read the email twice, then he got up, made a cup of tea, sat back down and read it a 3rd time. He called Eric McDonald in Victoria. "I got the assessment," he said. "And?" Hugh told him what the email said. There was a long pause. "Hugh," Eric said, "I know. Do you understand what that means in terms of, I've been sitting with it for about 45 minutes. Okay, Eric said, okay. What are you going to do? I'm going to make some more calls, Hugh said, and then I think I need to talk to someone about the right way to bring this to market. Eric exhaled slowly. There's a specialist auction house in Toronto, Hartwell Dodd. They handle exactly this category. Cultural artifact, historical instrument, documented provenance. They have the right buyer relationships. I know Hartwell Dodd, Hugh said. You want me to make the introduction? Yeah, Hugh said, if you don't mind. He hung up and sat for a moment. Outside the window, the Okanagan hills were brown and gray in the November light, the vineyards stripped bare, the lake in the distance flat and silver. He had lived here for 22 years. He and Donna had built their life in this valley, raised Zoe in this house, planted the apple tree in the backyard that was now taller than the fence. He thought about what it meant to see something that other people had looked at and dismissed. He thought about the green case sitting in the back bedroom. He thought about Dominic Farrell standing in that auction room with his hands on his lapels and his voice carrying easily across the floor, and the way he had looked at row 7 when he said whoever is bidding at $2,000 is making an error. Hugh finished his tea. He picked up his phone and started the next call. The auction at Hartwell Dodd in Toronto was scheduled for the 2nd Friday of December. The catalog entry for Hugh's instrument ran to 4 paragraphs, which was unusual. Most entries were 1 or 2. It included references to the Royal Academy assessment, citations from 2 independent luthiers who had physically examined the instrument at Hugh's expense in the weeks prior, and a historical summary of the maker's documented output, of which fewer than 30 examples were known to survive in verifiable condition. The catalog called it an exceptional and previously undocumented work of significant cultural importance. The estimate listed was not a number anyone had said out loud in the Kelowna auction house. Hugh drove to Toronto with Zoe, who had asked 3 weeks earlier if she could come, and whom Hugh had said yes to without hesitation. It was the first time Zoe had been to Toronto. She looked at the CN Tower from the hotel window and said, "It's bigger than in pictures." Hugh agreed that it usually was. The night before the auction, Hugh took Zoe to dinner at a restaurant near the hotel. Nothing fancy, a pasta place with paper tablecloths and candles in old wine bottles, and Zoe asked, over bread and butter, whether he was nervous. "Not really," Hugh said. Zoe looked at him with the particular expression she used when she thought he was understating something. "You bought it for $2,000, she said. $2,000 and a long drive," Hugh said. "Dad, I'm a little nervous," Hugh said. "But not about the auction." Zoe waited. "It's more," he started. "When you've been carrying something for a while, and you've been the only one who knew what it was, there's a part of you that gets used to that. That becomes the normal feeling. And then you're about to hand it to the world, and the world is going to have an opinion, and you have to let them." Zoe thought about this. Like when I played my solo at the recital and I'd been practicing it for months and it felt like mine, and then suddenly it was for everyone. Hugh looked at his daughter. "Yeah," he said. "Exactly like that." Zoe nodded. She tore a piece of bread. "You saw what it was before anyone else did," she said. "That doesn't stop being true no matter what they say about it." Hugh was quiet for a moment. "Your mum used to say something like that," he said. "I know," Zoe said. "You've told me." The Hartwell Dodd auction room was smaller than the Kelowna warehouse but considerably more deliberate in the impression it made. The catalog had been distributed in advance to a list of qualified buyers in Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany. Several institutions had submitted pre-auction inquiries. The instrument had been photographed by a professional documentary photographer, and the images had been published in an industry newsletter that circulated among collectors and cultural institutions in 3 countries. Hugh sat in the 3rd row with Zoe beside him. He was wearing the same jacket he'd worn to the Kelowna auction. He had noticed the face paint smear was still there, faint but present, and had decided to leave it. Dominic Farrell arrived at 12 minutes past 10. He came in from the side entrance with his assistant and the man in the darker suit and took a position near the left wall. He had a catalog in his hand, closed. He did not look at Hugh. The instrument came up 4th. Barry Westholt was not the auctioneer here. This was a woman named Christine Duval, small and precise, with reading glasses on a chain and a manner that suggested she had seen everything and would not be hurrying for anyone. She described the lot with the measured economy of someone who understood that the words in the catalog had already done most of the work. Opening bid, 40,000. By 70,000, 4 bidders had dropped out. By 120, it was 3. By 180, it was 2. Hugh and a number being relayed by phone from a bidder whose identity was not disclosed, which the woman beside Christine said was an institutional client in Germany. At 240,000, Dominic Farrell raised his paddle. Hugh glanced at him. Farrell's expression gave nothing away. At 280, the phone bidder paused. At 310, there was a longer pause. The room was very quiet. 310,000, Christine said, going once. The phone bidder came back. 330, Farrell 350. Phone 370. The pause that followed was the longest of the session. Christine's reading glasses rested on the bridge of her nose, and she looked at the phone relay assistant, and the assistant looked at her phone and said something quietly and looked up and shook her head. 370,000, Christine said, going once, going twice. A pause that was absolutely still. Sold. The room exhaled. Zoe, sitting beside Hugh, said nothing. She took his hand. Hugh sat with that for a moment. The number, the room, his daughter's hand in his, the green case that was now on a table at the front of the room and that no longer, in any practical sense, belonged to him. He thought about the side table near the fire exit in Kelowna. He thought about 9 minutes with his glasses on. He thought about all the things a person learns to see when they spend enough years paying attention to what other people decide isn't worth their time. He thought about a man standing in an auction room with his voice carrying easily and his eyes on row 7. He did not feel vindicated. Vindication was for people who had been arguing. Hugh had never argued. He had only known, in the way that you know things when you have spent long enough learning to look, and he had stood still in the face of someone else's certainty, and he had raised his paddle. The sale finalized 3 weeks later, after the standard authentication and transfer process that accompanies transactions of that significance. The net proceeds, after Hartwell Dodd's commission and the associated verification costs Hugh had absorbed, came to slightly above $320,000. He drove back to Vernon on a Tuesday in early January with Zoe in the passenger seat, watching the snow come down on the highway and asking, somewhere past Kamloops, what he was going to do with it. I don't know yet, Hugh said. Some of it should be for something specific, Zoe said. Yeah, like something you can see. Not just a number in an account. He thought about that. The hills were white on either side of the highway, the trees dark against the snow. Your mum always wanted to go to Nova Scotia, he said. She never did. She kept saying there was time. Zoe looked out the window for a while. We could go, she said. Yeah, Hugh said. We could go. They drove through the snow in comfortable quiet, the way two people drive when they know each other well enough that the silence is part of the conversation. Hugh thought about the green case. He thought about the moment he had stood at that preview table and seen, in the grain of old spruce and the curve of a hand-carved scroll, something that no one else in the room had been looking for. He thought about what it means to see clearly. Not perfectly, not without doubt, but clearly enough to trust what you're seeing when everyone around you has already decided there's nothing there. His daughter had said it at a pasta restaurant with paper tablecloths. You saw what it was before anyone else did. That doesn't stop being true. He kept that with him the way he kept most things that mattered. Quietly, without announcing it, the way a good piece of wood holds its grain. The lights of Vernon appeared through the snow at just past 6 in the evening, and Hugh Calloway turned off the highway and drove home.